You're such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is about the Thanksgiving Day abduction of Terri Lynn Hollis. Now, this was solved 50 years later, but this was a day that was supposed to be for family and being grateful beyond words for one another, but in this case, that turned into a 5-decade-long search for the person that changed all of that for an entire community. By the way, I post so much content like this, and I would be so incredibly happy if you would subscribe down below. Maybe share this with anyone you think would enjoy it, and if you want to make me extra happy, just thumbs up and leave a nice comment down below. But I just want to say really quick that it is Thanksgiving, so happy Thanksgiving to anybody watching if you do celebrate. But most importantly, I want to say that I am so thankful for all of you. You are so high up on the list of things that mean everything to me, and I cannot express my gratitude for you being here and watching my videos and caring how I tell these stories and listening to them. So I just want to say thank you. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1972 in California, and the Hollis family lived in Torrance. Now Ronald and Shirley had 2 children. They had a 16-year-old named Randy and an 11-year-old named Terri. Now this story is about Terri, and she was a 6th grader at the Hillside Elementary School and was very much into religion, and she was really about her faith, and she loved to request prayers at church, and she led prayers at school, and she was known to many as being a spark of life. She was just known for her excitement and her love, and she loved people. She really was just such a bubble of joy and of love and respect, and she was just such a pure, innocent soul. Then it was November 23rd of 1972, a regular Thanksgiving day for the Hollis family, and they would celebrate at their home on the 2600 block of Dale Mead Street. Now Terri loved to be around family, but she also loved to be active, and she would get bored very easily, as kids do, and so when Thanksgiving is a bunch of people sitting around and eating and chatting, that's often not fun for the kids, especially if there's not a whole bunch of kids around with them to play. And so Terri decided she was going to go outside and ride her bike for a while. Now this would be at about 3 p.m. and the thing is, there are very few sources on this case, but many would say some things that made me believe that Randy and Terri were the only 2 home alone at that time period at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and I'm not sure if that meant that their parents were out getting something or that they were supposed to meet them somewhere later. However, they were the only 2 home supposedly at this point, which would make sense as to why nobody was watching Terri as she stepped outside, or nobody had a problem with her leaving Thanksgiving. If, the whole family was there and they were all talking, I'm sure her parents wouldn't have wanted her to go out and ignore them. So it does make a little more sense, but at this point it is said that Randy and Terri were the only 2 home, and I'm not sure if Randy even knew that Terri went outside. Now, as anybody who watches true crime will probably have guessed by now, Terri did not return to her home, and when her family searched for her in the neighborhood, they couldn't find her. And like I said, this information is very sparse. However, the police were called and Terri was reported missing, and it was said they didn't arrive until about 9 p.m. Now, 6 hours for them to go and check out a possible missing person, even on Thanksgiving, is quite a lot of time, and so I'm assuming that the parents did come home sometime between 3 p.m. and 9 p.m. and found her missing then, and it was probably a little bit after 3 p.m., which is why the police wouldn't have gotten there until much later. Regardless, the investigators searched into the night and found nothing, and the neighborhood was scoured, but neither Terri nor her bike were found anywhere. The morning came and hope grew that with the light this beautiful young thing would be found, and the news would then spread that Terri Lynn Hollis was missing, and she was standing at 5 feet tall, weighing around 90 pounds, with blonde hair and blue eyes. Now the police wouldn't find her, but fishermen would. Now the Torrance Police Department would receive a call from 2 fishermen at about 10:15 the next day, the day after she'd gone missing, and they were in Ventura County at Point Mugu, and this was about an hour and a half from Torrance. Now they had been trying to find a place to cast their lines. Now they said that they were on the rocks 20 feet below the Pacific Coast Highway on the shoreline. They were looking for a place to cast their lines when they would come across something that they couldn't even have possibly imagined in their worst nightmares. Now the body of a little girl could be seen at the bottom of the cliff, and she was completely naked besides a white t-shirt. And these 2 fishermen had kind of heard about Terri's disappearance and immediately called the Torrance Police Department to let them know that they believed they had found her. Now the police arrived at the scene, and Terri would be identified by her uncle, Herbert Ray Pierce, which I'm assuming was because it was to keep the family from having to see their daughter like that, and so he would probably say that he would do it for them. But she was identified. She was also taken in for an autopsy, where unfortunately it was found that she was sexually assaulted, and her cause of death was found to be strangulation. 2 days later, on November 26th, the Hollis family would begin to receive calls about Terri's murder, and it wasn't specified exactly what this caller was saying, but the police feared that this person may really know what had happened to Terri, and the community was in such of a panic 24/7 now that they were on high alert for anyone and any clue that they could find that would link them to who had done this. And so they went to the Hollis house and they tapped their phones and they waited for the caller to call again. And he would. He was traced to his home and found to be a 16-year-old boy named Redondo Beach. And they interrogated him for many hours to make sure that he wasn't the killer, or if he was, that they were going to lock him away. And by the end of their questioning, they realized that he was simply just a prank caller. He was a horrible human with very little empathy doing this, but he wasn't Terri's killer. Now the investigators began to question anybody in the neighborhood. I mean, this was about 2,000 interviews they would do, and they would really hone in on the sex offenders in the area. And after interviewing so many, they finally got what they thought could have been a lead. And this would be from one of the neighbors who was thought to be a witness. And they had said they had seen a man riding a bike with Terri, who was also on a bike, and this was about an hour after she was last seen, so at about 4:15. Because of this, a sketch was made and released to the public as to what this witness had seen this man on the bike looking like, and the LAPD would even help in making this sketch even better, because that one wasn't the best that it could have been, and it was even more detailed. Now they released that one as well. However, even after these sketches were released, nobody in the community came forward saying that they knew this person. So it didn't seem like this person was a local. A reward of $1,000 would be posted, and that day they would get 14 calls coming in with information. However, these didn't have any leads that were substantial at all, and really it didn't help in the investigation. And quickly a year passed with 0 answers, and the Hollis family having no idea what happened to their daughter. Then finally this sketch of the man that had been made was identified by someone a year later, and they had said that it was a neighborhood boy who was with a girl that was from the neighborhood as well, but it wasn't Terri. And so this only lead that they seemed to have was now gone. The only real theory the investigators had now was that possibly Terri had gone 2 miles from her home to a neighborhood park called Walteria Park, and was possibly abducted from there, and they even believe that she had known her killer, or at least that's what they told the public. Now, there had been 2 other girls who had been killed about a decade earlier around this area, and it was off the shore of Corona del Mar, and one of which had been found floating in the river and had also been sexually assaulted. And at first they looked into it as possibly having a connection, but they couldn't find any evidence to fully connect the two. And that other case had never been solved either, so it's not like that would have helped in the investigation at all. And quickly, Terri's case went cold as well, and the police chief even said, "This crime is what nightmares are made of, and no family should ever have to go through such a tragedy." The next year, in 1974, it had been 2 years without answers in this case, and a 29-year-old Gardena man would be arrested that February. His name is Ronald Paul Kozak, and he was arrested on suspicion of child molestation. And while he had been arrested, the police began to look into him as possibly having to do with Terri's murder. Now, he pled not guilty, and because there was no evidence to hold him on those charges, the charges were dropped. But only 2 weeks later, he would plead guilty to a completely separate charge of child molestation of a 10-year-old boy. This is basically where Terri's case would halt for many, many years. But then in 2000, 26 years later, the police department in Torrance were still just as passionate about finding Terri's killer, and that's exactly what they were planning to do. They opened her file yet again, and they found that DNA had actually been collected from her body from the crime scene, and it was sent to a crime lab in LA, where it was then processed into CODIS, or Combined DNA Index System, and it didn't match anyone in there, unfortunately. But this would not be the end of Terri Lynn's story. You see, in 2015, the police decided they were going to take a different route with Terri's DNA, and they were going to enter it into a genetic genealogy website. And this has been used recently in many, many cold cases to find killers. And in fact, it was used to find the serial killer, Golden State Killer, which I have done a video on. If you would like to hear it, I'll link it down below. But it can really help in finding so many different answers that these killers believed couldn't have even been possible when they were committing these crimes, because even if their DNA isn't in the system, if a relative of theirs is, we can catch them. And that's exactly what would happen in this case. In 2018, 46 years after this murder, a killer would be found. Or at least they hoped at this point. You see, they had traced this man back to Maricopa, Arizona, where he had died in 2003 from medical complications. Now, the next year, which would be this year, 2019, the investigators would go to Arizona and exhume this man's body to take his bones to test against the DNA found at the crime scene, and they would find that it was a match. Jake Edward Brown was a killer, and he had killed Terri Lynn Hollis. Jake had been 36 when he killed Terri, and he often went by Thomas Tracy Burham. He had a whole bunch of different aliases. He moved around a lot, and this was mainly because he was committing so many crimes. He was trying to not get caught for them, of course. I mean, he had been arrested in 2 different cases of rape charges after Terri's murder. He had also been arrested on charges of robbery, narcotics possession. I mean, he was not a great guy in the slightest at all, and had a huge criminal record. A police detective spoke up this year when they finally found the killer, saying there was something about the possibility that she might have known her killer that in some ways was comforting for a community that thought, this is not just some predator, right? But it turns out that's exactly what it was. Now, like I said before, the police had really told the community this was someone she had known, and her killer was someone that she had come in contact with, and I assume that that is because it made the community a little less frightened, because they thought, oh, well, she knew this person. Maybe I don't know this person, so they won't come after me. And so it kind of settled their anxiety, because if you just say there's a monster on the loose who doesn't care who they kill, that's even more terrifying. But it turns out that's exactly what it was. After all of these years, investigators hadn't given up, and because of this, they had finally solved Terri's case. Unfortunately, it was just a few years too late, because her parents had already passed away and were unable to see that her killer had been identified. But her brother Randy was alive and well and was thrilled that this case finally was solved after all of these years. At a press conference they did to announce that they had found Jake Edward Brown as her killer, Randy would actually speak to the public and would say, "When you think about it, 47 years, it's amazing that we've come to this day. I only wish that my parents were alive to see this." Now, Terri's parents, after she had been found, were very, very helpful in the community, especially her father. He would go on a neighborhood watch system, and he would walk kids to the places they needed to go whenever they needed to get there, so they weren't walking alone. They really did whatever they could to make sure that this didn't happen to another child, and it's heartbreaking that they didn't get to see that there would be justice, even if the killer was already dead, because now his name would forever be tainted with being Terri's killer. And Randy even spoke to the families of missing people or murder victims who had never had cases solved to never give up hope, and that he had often thought that this was never going to come in Terri's case, but it had, even almost 50 years later, and that he had mourned his sister every single Thanksgiving, but answers had finally come, and they could come for other people too. But here we are 50 years later, and he would say, "A lot was taken from us that day, and throughout my life. Thanksgiving Day, I always allow for a private moment to remember Terri." And that's what I hope that this case can do, is take a moment this Thanksgiving to remember Terri, and to remember all of the other families, really, of these victims who have never gotten answers, and to know that they're not alone. They are in our minds and are one big family with us, and we care, and we take on the grief and the mourning this Thanksgiving with them. We take it off their shoulders a bit so they can have a moment to breathe. And that's all I really wanted to, that's all I ever want to do with these cases, is to help these families find answers. I just hope that this Thanksgiving that we all can be there for one another, and make it so that nobody is holding the weight of the world on their own, and that we are constantly spreading love to everyone and are so grateful for what we do have in our life, with still remembering what other people don't. So I do hope that you have a wonderful Thanksgiving Day, and if you don't celebrate, maybe just make a list of things that you're grateful in your own life for, because I think that that is always a wonderful thing to do, and it just makes you grateful for life in general. And even if things are going horribly wrong in your life, you can still find that light and the good and the joy that is still in this world for you to have, and you still deserve it. So I don't know, this case made me emotional in ways that I didn't even quite understand, really, but I think Thanksgiving in general makes me emotional, because I do think of all the things that I'm grateful for, and I just seriously want you to know how much I care about each and every one of you, and I don't take any of your support for granted. Every like, every comment, every subscriber, every view, it's not about the numbers to me, it's that you are people creating those, and your support makes me want to cry. So I think I should probably go, because obviously I need to calm down. But I love you. Don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay. Bye.